You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But the morning she walked into my courtroom, carrying that old lunchbox, I felt something shift inside me that I still can't fully explain. It wasn't the lunchbox itself. It was what it represented, what it told me about who she was before she even opened her mouth. And when I finally understood the whole story, when all the pieces came together right there in my courtroom, I had to pause. I literally had to stop everything and just take a breath. Because some moments in this job remind you exactly why you showed up in the first place. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years. 40 years. When I say that out loud, even I find it hard to believe sometimes. I put on these robes for the first time in 1984, and I have put them on almost every single morning since. The routine never changes. I get to the courthouse at 8:15. I've done that since day one. Before I sit down at my desk, before I look at a single file, I pour myself a cup of coffee. Strong, black, no sugar, no cream. Christina, my clerk, has known this for years. Some mornings she already has it waiting for me before I even hang up my coat, and I appreciate that more than she probably knows. Christina has been with me for a long time. She's sharp, she's organized, and she reads people almost as well as I do. Actually, some days I think she reads them better. When she gives me a certain look across the courtroom, a slight raise of the eyebrow, a small press of her lips, I know something is about to happen. I've learned to trust that look completely. My father came to this country from Italy when he was a young man. He came with nothing. No money, no connections, barely any English. Just a willingness to work hard and a deep, unshakable belief that if you treated people with respect and did what was right, this country would give you a chance. He worked 2 jobs his whole life. He never complained. He used to sit me down when I was a boy and say, "Frank, you don't need to be the richest man in the room. You just need to be the most decent one." I carry those words with me every single day. Every single day I walk into that courthouse. Early in my career, before I fully understood what this job really meant, I had a mentor named Judge Antonelli. Old Italian man, thick glasses, hands like a carpenter. He pulled me aside one afternoon after a session and said something I never forgot. He said, "Frank, this bench is not a throne. It's a table where ordinary people come to be heard. Your job is to listen, really listen, not just to their words. Listen to what they're not saying. Listen to what they're afraid to say." I was young, maybe 32, 33. I didn't fully understand what he meant yet, but I do now. I've been married to my wife for 48 years. She is the anchor of my life. She knows when I've had a hard day before I say a single word. She'll look at me when I come through the door and just know. On the really tough days, she'll pour me a glass of wine and sit across from me at the kitchen table and just listen. She doesn't try to fix anything. She just listens. She taught me something important about that. She taught me that sometimes being present is the most powerful thing you can offer another person. My grandson turned 12 last week. We had a little party for him at the house. I watched him running around with his cousins, and I thought about all the years this job has taken me away from family dinners and Saturday mornings. But I also thought about what I hope he learns from watching me. I hope he learns that service matters, that showing up for others matters, that how you treat the person who has nothing tells the world everything about who you are. That particular morning, I remember the sky was that flat gray color that Providence gets in early spring. Not quite winter anymore, but not warm either. Cold enough that people were still in their heavier coats. I'd driven to the courthouse the way I always do, past the same streets I've known my whole life, past the old neighborhood where I grew up, past the church my parents attended every Sunday without fail. That drive grounds me. It reminds me where I came from before I walk into that building and put on the robe. When I got to my chambers that morning, Christina handed me my coffee and gave me the docket for the day. Standard morning, parking violations, a couple of registration cases, a few moving violations. Nothing extraordinary on paper. I flipped through the files the way I always do, getting a feel for the day ahead. I sipped my coffee, and I remember thinking it was going to be a quiet one. That's the thing about this job. The days that change you are never the ones you see coming. The days that stay with you forever arrive looking like any other Tuesday, or in this case, any other Wednesday. Something did feel a little different that morning, though. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The way Christina was arranging things at her desk, a little more carefully than usual. The way two of the officers near the door were speaking quietly to each other and glanced my way when I walked through. Small things, things that most people wouldn't notice. But after 40 years, you develop a sensitivity to the atmosphere in a room. You learn to feel the temperature of a day before it officially begins. I settled into my seat, straightened my robe, and got ready to hear the first case. The first person I called that morning was a woman named Rosa Delgado. I watched her walk in, and I knew immediately she was nervous. Not guilty nervous, scared nervous. There's a big difference, and you learn to tell them apart. Guilty people try too hard to look calm. Scared people just look fragile. Rosa looked fragile. She was maybe in her late 50s, a small woman with dark hair going gray at the temples. She was wearing a coat that was clean but old, the kind of coat that's been washed so many times the color has faded from black to something closer to charcoal. She held her purse in front of her with both hands, clutching the strap like it was keeping her upright. I looked down at her file before I addressed her. Parking violation. Expired meter. The fine was not large, but even a small fine can feel enormous to someone who is just barely keeping things together. I've learned that too. What looks small from the outside can feel catastrophic from the inside. I asked her to come closer to the microphone. She walked forward carefully, like she was trying not to make any noise. I said, "Miss Delgado, can you tell me what happened?" She looked up at me with these tired eyes and she said, "Your Honor, I was visiting my sister at the hospital. She's very sick. I was only supposed to be 30 minutes, but then the doctor came in and I didn't want to leave, and I lost track of time. I came back to the car and the ticket was already there." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "How is your sister doing?" And she blinked, like she wasn't expecting me to ask that. She said, "Not good, Your Honor. She's not good." and her voice cracked just a little on that last word, just enough for me to hear it. Something about her reminded me of my own mother. My mother used to visit her sister every week, without fail, for 20 years. Even when it was hard, even when she was tired, she never missed. Rosa Delgado had the same kind of steadiness in her face, that worn, faithful look of someone who keeps showing up for the people she loves, no matter what. I said, "Case dismissed. You go take care of your sister." Her eyes filled up, just for a second, and she nodded and said, "Thank you, Your Honor. God bless you." I watched her walk out, and I felt the way I always feel in those moments. Grateful. Grateful that this bench gives me the chance to see people as people, not just as case numbers. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone in your life who showed up for others with absolutely nothing to gain? Someone who keeps giving even when they have very little left? Because this story is full of those people. And I want you to appreciate that as we go on. Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. It helps more people find these stories, and some of these stories really need to be found. I heard the next few cases. A young man with a speeding ticket who was genuinely apologetic. An older gentleman who'd forgotten to update his registration and looked absolutely mortified about it. Normal morning. The gallery was maybe half full. People sitting in the wooden benches waiting for their names to be called. Some anxious, some bored, some on their phones. That's when I noticed her. She came in between cases, slipping in through the back door with the kind of practiced ease of someone who assumes every room will accommodate them. I noticed her because of the way she entered. Most people who come into my courtroom come in quietly. They sit down. They wait their turn. They understand instinctively that this is a place that requires a certain behavior. She didn't seem to get that memo. She was dressed expensively. I noticed that right away. A coat that didn't look like it had ever seen a sale rack. Shoes that clicked on the floor with purpose. Hair that looked like someone had spent real time and real money on it that very morning. She had a large designer handbag on one arm and a phone in her other hand, and she was already looking at the screen as she found a seat in the gallery. I watched her sit down. I noticed she didn't look around the room the way most people do when they walk into a courtroom for the first time. She didn't seem the least bit uncertain. She had the posture of someone who expected the world to wait for her. That was when I noticed something else, something completely different, something that caught my eye from across the room. Sitting not far from this woman, in the same row of gallery benches, was a younger woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s. She was wearing scrubs under her open coat, the pale blue kind that nurses wear. She had a badge clipped to her lapel, and on her lap, held carefully with both hands, was a lunchbox. Not a stylish bag or a nice tote, a plain rectangular lunchbox, the kind with a clasp on the front, old enough that the color had worn off in places on the corners. It was clearly something she had used for a long time. I kept moving through the docket. I called the next case, but I kept coming back to her in my mind. That lunchbox. There was something about it that I couldn't let go of. Then I saw the moment that told me everything I needed to know. The woman in the expensive coat glanced over at the nurse. She looked her up and down. And then she did something that made my jaw tighten. She smirked, not a smile, a smirk, the kind that says, "I'm better than you, and I know it." She actually looked at that nurse, that woman who had clearly come straight from a night shift or was about to go to one, and she allowed herself a visible moment of contempt. Then she went back to her phone. I saw it. I saw it clearly, and it told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with before her name was ever called. I called a few more cases. All the while I was watching the woman in the expensive coat, watching how she held herself, watching how she glanced impatiently toward Christina every few minutes, as if the proceedings were an inconvenience being arranged specifically to bother her. She checked her phone continuously. At one point, she actually sighed out loud, a long theatrical exhale that was just barely quiet enough to not be a direct interruption. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't going to end well, not for her. Then, at around 10:30, Christina looked at the docket and called out the name, Margaret Holloway. I looked down at the file. The woman stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every step was deliberate, confident to the point of arrogance. She stood in front of my bench with her designer bag still on her arm, and her phone, I noticed, still in her hand. Not put away, still in her hand. I looked up from the file, and I looked at her directly. I said, "Ms. Holloway, you can put your phone away, please." She looked at me for just a moment, then tucked the phone into her bag. She did it slowly, like she was doing me a favor. I said, "Ms. Holloway, you're here today on 3 violations. Failure to stop at a posted stop sign, operating a vehicle with an expired registration, and a citation for reckless driving." I looked up at her. "Do you understand these charges?" She looked at me and she said, "Your Honor, yes, I understand. But I'd like to explain that I was running very late that morning. I had a critical business meeting, and the stop sign in question is in an area where I've honestly never seen any pedestrian traffic. The registration thing was just an oversight. My assistant dropped the ball on that." I sat back slightly in my chair. I said, "I see. So it's your assistant's fault." She said, "I'm just saying it wasn't intentional. Things like that get missed." I asked her about the reckless driving citation. I said, "The officer notes here that you were driving at a significantly elevated speed in a school zone. Can you explain that?" And she smiled. She actually smiled. Not apologetically, not nervously. A patient smile, like someone talking to a person who isn't quite getting it. She said, "Your Honor, there were no children present. It was early morning. I was late for something important, and I adjusted accordingly. I think calling it reckless is a bit dramatic." I heard a small sound from Christina's direction. I glanced over. Her eyes were fixed on her desk, but her jaw was just slightly tighter than usual. I knew what that meant. I leaned forward a little. I kept my voice steady. I said, "Ms. Holloway, a school zone has a speed limit, regardless of whether children are visible at that exact moment. The limit exists because children are unpredictable. They appear suddenly. They run into streets. The law doesn't say you can speed through a school zone if you happen to look and not see any children. It says you can't speed through a school zone. Period." She looked at me with an expression that was almost pity, like I had just explained something she already knew and found tedious. She said, "Your Honor, I understand the technicality. I just think the punishment should reflect the actual risk, not the theoretical one. I felt my blood pressure rising. I'm not going to lie. 40 years and that particular flavor of arrogance still gets to me. Not because I lose my temper, I don't, but because I know what that attitude costs in the real world. I've seen it. I've seen it in cases that started exactly like this one and ended somewhere much darker. I said to her, "Ms. Holloway, this is a court of law, not a negotiation. The risk you took was real, whether or not a child was hurt. And I'd like to remind you that we are here today precisely because your behavior on the road was documented by a law enforcement officer as dangerous." She looked at me and said, "Your Honor, I appreciate your perspective. I'm happy to pay whatever the fine is. I have a lunch appointment at noon." The gallery was quiet. That kind of quiet where everyone is holding their breath a little. I said, "You have a lunch appointment?" She said, "Yes, I'm already running behind on my morning." I said, "Ms. Holloway, I want to make something very clear to you. This courtroom does not operate on your schedule. This courtroom operates on the schedule of justice. And right now, justice requires your full and respectful attention." She pressed her lips together. She said, "Of course, Your Honor. I didn't mean any disrespect." But she did mean it. That's the thing. You can say the right words and still mean every bit of the disrespect. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. Not because I was angry in a way that would affect my judgment, but because I was sitting across from someone who had walked into my courtroom and looked at a tired nurse carrying a worn lunchbox and smirked. Someone who had just told me she drove at dangerous speeds through a school zone, and the main thing on her mind was her lunch appointment. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone treat serious things like they're inconvenient, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me on this one. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I genuinely never saw coming in my entire career. Not once in 40 years. I was about to address the fines and the conditions when I noticed something in the gallery shift. A man who had been sitting quietly near the back stood up. He was wearing a dark suit. He was holding something in his hand. He raised it and said, "Your Honor, may I approach?" I looked at him. I said, "Identify yourself, please." He said, "Your Honor, my name is David Reyes. I'm an assistant United States attorney with the District of Rhode Island." The courtroom changed in that instant. The air changed. I felt it before, that particular shift that happens when something much bigger than what you thought you were dealing with suddenly reveals itself. I looked at him. I looked at Ms. Holloway. She had gone very still. I said, "Mr. Reyes, what brings you to my courtroom today?" He said, "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My office has been conducting an investigation. Ms. Holloway is known to us, and we have reason to believe that today may present an opportunity that my office has been working toward for some time. I have a sealed document I'd like to submit to the court." I looked at Christina. She was already moving. She walked over to him, took the envelope he was holding, and brought it to me. I looked at it for a moment. A sealed federal envelope. In 40 years, that doesn't happen every day. That doesn't happen most years. I opened it. I read what was inside. I had to read it twice. I set the papers down on my bench, and I removed my glasses, and I rubbed my eyes. I do that when I need a moment to process something. I put my glasses back on, and I looked at the document again to make sure I was reading it correctly. I was. Before I tell you what those charges were, let me ask you this. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Do you think that having money, real money, should place a person in a different category under the law? I want to know what you think about that. Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely read them. And if you believe what I believe, that every single person stands equal before the law, regardless of what's in their bank account, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly what this story is about. The document outlined a federal investigation that had been ongoing for over 2 years. Margaret Holloway was a principal in a financial services firm in Providence. The investigation alleged that she had been orchestrating a scheme, a systematic, deliberate scheme to defraud elderly clients, not strangers, clients who trusted her, people who had handed her their retirement savings, their life savings, money they had worked decades to accumulate. The document alleged amounts running into the millions, multiple victims. Some of them had lost everything. I set the document down again. I looked at Margaret Holloway. She was still standing at the front of my courtroom, but she looked different now. Something had gone out of her. That practiced composure, that careful armor of confidence. I could see it starting to crack. Her eyes were moving quickly, from me to Mr. Reyes, to the document in front of me, and back to me again. Calculating, searching for the exit that wasn't there. I said, Ms. Holloway, I need you to remain where you are. She said, Your Honor, I don't know what that document says, but I would like to speak with my attorney. I said, that is absolutely your right, but right now I need you to stand right where you are. I had a feeling in my chest that I've only felt a handful of times in 40 years. Not satisfaction exactly, not anger, something more complicated. The weight of a moment where the full scope of something is revealing itself in real time, and you have to be steady enough to hold it. I thought about the people in that document, elderly men and women who had trusted this person, who had probably sat across from her in a nice office and been charmed by exactly the kind of confident assurance she had walked into my courtroom with, who had handed over their savings because she made them feel safe. And she had taken that trust and used it to take everything they had. I looked at her and I said something that I want you to remember. I said, Ms. Holloway, 2 hours ago you walked into this courtroom with a lunch appointment on your mind. You sat in this gallery and looked at a woman in nursing scrubs like she was beneath you. I saw that. I see everything in this courtroom. I want you to understand something. That nurse, that woman you looked at with contempt, she's worth 10 of what you've shown me today. And the people in this document, the people your firm allegedly defrauded, they trusted you with their lives, with their futures, and you apparently treated that trust the same way you treat everything else, like it existed to serve you. The courtroom was completely silent. I've had silent courtrooms before, but this was different. This was the silence of people holding something together inside themselves. I watched her start to crumble. I've seen it before. That moment when the performance can no longer hold, when the weight of reality becomes too heavy for the facade. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts in small places. The hands first. Her hands, those hands that had been so casual, so dismissive all morning, started to tremble, just slightly, just enough for me to see it from where I sat. Then her chin, a small, barely visible quiver, the kind of movement that people try desperately to suppress and almost manage to, but not quite. She looked at me with eyes that were no longer calculating. They were frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened. She said, "Your Honor, please, please, I have children. I have a family." I had to pause. I heard those words and I had to pause, because I am not a hard man. I don't enjoy watching anyone suffer. I have children too. I have grandchildren. I understand what it means to think about your family in a desperate moment. But I thought about the families in that document. The elderly man who probably worked 40 years building something to leave his children. The woman who had come to trust her retirement to someone she believed was honest. They had families too. They had children too. And their children were now dealing with a very different reality because of choices Margaret Holloway had made. Choices that had nothing to do with forgetfulness or oversight. Choices made deliberately over years for personal gain. I said to her quietly, because the quiet moments are often the most powerful. I said, "Ms. Holloway, 2 hours ago you were laughing in this room. Now you're asking me for mercy. I want you to remember this feeling, because the people in this document have been feeling something like this for a long time. They've been feeling it every day since they found out what happened to their savings." I saw her put her hand over her mouth. I said, "I'm going to do my job, Ms. Holloway, and so is the federal government. Mr. Reyes, please proceed." 2 federal agents who had been waiting near the back of the courtroom walked forward. They moved with that quiet, practiced authority that federal agents have. They didn't rush. They came to where she was standing, and one of them said something to her in a low voice, explaining what was happening, what her rights were. I watched as they placed handcuffs on her wrists. The click of handcuffs is a sound I have heard many times. It never becomes ordinary, not to me. It is always the sound of a life turning a corner it cannot come back from. It always carries weight. The designer handbag she had been carrying slipped from her arm as they placed the cuffs. It fell to the floor and landed with a soft thud. Nobody moved to pick it up. It just stayed there on the floor of my courtroom. That expensive bag on the plain linoleum floor. I remember looking at it and thinking about what it represented and what it couldn't buy and what it was worth right now in that moment, none of which was very much. She walked out with the agents. Before she reached the door, she looked back at me once. I held her gaze. I wanted her to look at me. I wanted her to carry that moment. The door closed. The courtroom exhaled. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like that one. Not because someone was arrested. That's not the joy of it. The joy of it is that the law worked the way it was supposed to work. That a woman who had sat in this room and treated other people like they were less than her found out that my courtroom doesn't see her that way. That no courtroom should. If this story is doing something for you, if it's stirring something in you about equal justice, show me that by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories matter. I sat there for a moment after she was gone. The gallery was unusually quiet. Then slowly the room returned to normal, people shifting, whispering. Christina caught my eye and gave me a look that said everything without saying anything at all. I called the next case, because that's what you do. You keep going. But I carried that morning with me for the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Mr. Reyes came to my chambers. He knocked and I told him to come in. He sat down across from me at my desk, the same desk I've sat behind for decades. and he laid out the full scope of what his office had been investigating. He told me they had identified over 30 victims, 30 families. Some of them had lost their entire retirement savings. We're talking about people who had worked their whole lives, people in their 70s and 80s who had handed over everything they had because they trusted this woman's firm. The total alleged losses were somewhere between $4 and $6 million. He said the number was still being calculated as more victims came forward. He told me they had been watching for an opportunity to move on her for months. They had known about the traffic violations and had been monitoring her court date, hoping to use it as a moment to make contact, to serve papers in a controlled setting. He said they hadn't expected the case to unfold quite the way it did, but that he was grateful for the way I had handled it. I sat there thinking about how I had almost just fined her and sent her on her way. If Mr. Reyes hadn't stood up, if that document hadn't arrived, she would have paid a few $100s and been in time for her lunch appointment, and those 30 families would still be waiting for justice that might have been years away. The thought of that made me feel something I can only describe as the weight of how thin the margin can be between justice and injustice. I thought about my father sitting me down as a boy and telling me to be decent. I thought about what those elderly victims had done to deserve what happened to them. They had been decent. They had done everything right. They had saved and trusted and believed. And someone had taken advantage of every single one of those qualities. I said to Mr. Reyes before he left, I said, I hope they get everything back, every penny. He looked at me and said, we're going to do everything we can, Your Honor. I believed him. That evening when I got home, my wife looked at me when I walked through the door. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, hard one today? I said, yeah, it was. She poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does. When I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine, and she said, you did right. I already knew that, but hearing her say it meant more than I can tell you. 2 months later, I was in my chambers going through the morning mail before court when I found a letter with a prison return address. The name on the return address label was Margaret Holloway. I held it for a long time before I opened it. I'll be honest, my first instinct was not to open it at all. Not out of anger. I don't hold on to anger. It's not productive and it's not healthy. But because I wasn't sure what kind of thing I was ready to receive from her. I wasn't sure if it would be an appeal for sympathy or some kind of justification for what she had done. But something made me open it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the part of me that still, after everything, holds on to the belief that people are capable of arriving at genuine understanding. I don't know. I opened it. Her handwriting was neat, small and precise. She wrote about 6 paragraphs. She wrote that she had spent the first 2 weeks after her arrest in a state of disbelief. She said she kept telling herself that her lawyers would fix it, that money would fix it, that somehow the situation would resolve in a way that returned her life to what it was. She said it took about 3 weeks before she understood that wasn't going to happen, that nothing was going to return things to what they were. She wrote that she had thought about what I said to her in the courtroom, about the nurse with the lunchbox. She said she had thought about that more than anything else I said. She wrote, and I'm reading this as closely to directly as I can remember it. She wrote, "I looked at that woman and I judged her entire life in 2 seconds. I decided she was less than me because of what she was wearing and what she was carrying. I had no idea who she was. I had no idea what she had survived to be sitting in that room at that hour of the morning. And the truth is, even if I had known, I'm not sure it would have changed anything. And that's the thing I'm most ashamed of." She went on to say that she had been in the financial industry since she was 25, that she had grown up in a culture that measured everything in numbers: portfolio performance, net worth, annual returns. She said she had started cutting corners because the pressure to perform was relentless, and at some point the distinction between her money and her clients' money had blurred in a way that she was only now able to see clearly from the outside. She said she was not asking for sympathy. She said she was writing because she needed someone to know that she understood now what she hadn't understood before. She ended the letter with 4 words: "I'm sorry for them." I sat with that letter for a long time. I don't know exactly what I felt reading it. I believe it was sincere. I think when people are stripped of everything, when the performance becomes impossible, something real sometimes comes through. I hope that's what that letter was. And I think about my father's words, about being decent. I wonder if decency is something that can be found again after being lost for a long time. I don't know the answer to that. I believe in second chances. I believe in the possibility of real change. I hold both of those things at the same time as the understanding that consequences are real and necessary and just. I filed the letter in a drawer. I still have it. 3 days after the arrest, while the federal case was still being processed and the story was beginning to reach the local news, I was in my chambers when there was a knock at my door. Christina opened it and looked at me with an expression I recognized. She said, "There's someone here who'd like to speak with you, Your Honor. She doesn't have an appointment." I said, "Who is it?" Christina smiled. She said, "The nurse." I stood up from my desk. She came in a little hesitantly, standing in the doorway of my chambers, in her scrubs and her old coat. She was holding the lunchbox, the same one. She looked at me and she said, "I'm sorry to bother you, Your Honor. I don't want to take up your time. I just needed to say something." I said, "Please come in. Please sit down." She sat in the chair across from my desk. She told me her name was Diane. She said she had been sitting in my courtroom that morning because she had a parking ticket she was contesting. She said she worked nights at Rhode Island Hospital, 12-hour shifts. She said she had been doing it for 11 years. She had come straight from a shift that morning, had barely had time to go home and change before getting to the courthouse. She had brought her lunchbox because she hadn't had a chance to eat. She said she had noticed the woman in the expensive coat looking at her. She said she was used to it. She said that was just something she had learned to absorb over the years. The way certain people looked at nurses, like they were invisible unless they were needed, and then suddenly very visible. But she said that what happened in my courtroom that morning had changed something for her. She said watching the law work the way it did, watching someone be held accountable, regardless of their money, regardless of their social standing, had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing. She said she had gone home after court and cried for about 20 minutes, and she wasn't entirely sure why, but she thought it was relief. A kind of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. She said, "Your Honor, I just wanted to thank you for doing your job. I know that sounds strange, but I needed to see that today." I looked at this woman, this tired, honest, hardworking woman who had sat in my courtroom with her worn lunchbox after a 12-hour night shift and still took the time to come back and say thank you. I thought about what she said about being invisible, about absorbing the looks, about going 11 years doing one of the most essential jobs in the world and sometimes feeling like no one sees you. I said to her, "Diane, can I tell you something?" She nodded. I said, "I saw you the moment you walked in. I saw that lunchbox and I thought, there is someone who shows up every day, someone who does the real work that keeps this world running. And I want you to know that in my courtroom, in this room right here, what you carry in that lunchbox matters infinitely more than what anyone carries in a $1,000 handbag. What you bring to that hospital every night is worth more than any investment portfolio. I mean that with every part of me." Her eyes were wet. She blinked a few times, and then she straightened up and she said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to go home and sleep for about 10 hours. I laughed, a real laugh. She laughed too, and she stood up and shook my hand and walked out of my chambers. I stood there for a moment after she left. I put my hands on my desk, and I just stood there. A year later, through channels that I won't detail completely because they involved other people's private information, I learned that some of the recovered funds from the Holloway case had been directed through a restitution process toward a community assistance fund. And from that fund, a scholarship had been established at a local nursing school, a scholarship specifically for working adults pursuing careers in healthcare, people who were already in the profession, already showing up, already doing the work, who needed support to go further. I was told, and this is the part that I'm not ashamed to say brought actual tears to my eyes. I was told that among the first recipients of that scholarship was a young woman whose mother was a nurse at Rhode Island Hospital. A young woman who had grown up watching her mother come home exhausted and still find time to sit with her and help with homework. Who had grown up watching her mother pack that same lunchbox every night before a shift. Who wanted to be a nurse herself. I don't know how to describe what I felt when I heard that. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I still don't have a word big enough for that particular feeling. The sense of a circle completing. The sense that something that started in ugliness and contempt had turned, by the working of the law, and maybe by something bigger than the law, into something that would help someone build a future. I thought about Margaret Holloway in that prison cell, writing her letter. I thought about Diane coming back to my chambers in her scrubs and her old coat. I thought about the 30 families who had been defrauded, about the elderly man who had trusted someone with his retirement, about all the invisible people who show up every day and do the work and ask very little in return except to be treated with basic human dignity. I think about that day often. I think about what it taught me or what it confirmed in me about things I have believed my whole career. My father came to this country with nothing. He built a life through work and honesty and a stubborn, enduring belief in the dignity of other people. He never looked at anyone and decided they were less than him, not once. I watched him his entire life, and I never once saw him diminish another human being. He taught me by example that how you treat the person who can do nothing for you tells the world exactly who you are. After 40 years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. I believe that with everything I have. On any given morning in my courtroom, I might stand before a doctor and a dishwasher, a CEO and a cashier, and the law sees them the same way, exactly the same way. That is not just a legal principle to me, it is a moral one. It is the foundation on which I have built my entire life's work. Money can buy comfort. Money can buy access. Money can buy almost everything this world puts a price tag on. But it cannot buy character. It cannot buy the respect of people who have seen you at your worst and still choose to treat you with dignity. It cannot buy the quiet self-knowledge of having done the right thing when no one was watching. And it absolutely cannot buy your way above the law. Not in my courtroom, not ever. I think about Diane and her lunchbox every time I feel the weight of this job pressing down. Every time I wonder if it matters, if any of it matters. I think about her walking into my chambers in her scrubs and saying, "Thank you for doing your job." Like it was something extraordinary. And maybe it was. Maybe it should be extraordinary that a public servant actually serves. Maybe after all these years of watching people be treated as invisible, I should never take for granted the moments when the system actually works. But I don't think it has to be extraordinary. I think it can just be what we do. I think it can be the baseline, the minimum, the floor of how we treat each other. I think Diane deserves to walk into any room, anywhere, and be seen as exactly what she is: essential, worthy, human. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, on Margaret Holloway, or not harsh enough? I genuinely want to know. I'm not asking rhetorically. I've wrestled with that question myself in the quiet moments. There is a part of me that felt something, watching her walk out of that courtroom in handcuffs. Not cruelty, never that. But I also think about the 30 families. I think about the lives disrupted. I think about the trust broken. And I think harshness is the wrong word entirely. I think justice is the right one. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? If you had seen what I saw that morning, the smirk, the dismissal, the casual contempt, and then read that document, and then had to sit behind that bench and make decisions in real time, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy? Would you have delivered justice? Are those two things even as different as they seem? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. I mean that. Some of the most thoughtful things I've encountered in recent years have come from people watching these stories and leaving their honest responses. You surprise me regularly, in the best way. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. These stories come from real life, from real people who walk through those doors with real struggles and real courage, and sometimes real arrogance. And every single one of them taught me something. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's ever felt invisible, someone who carries a worn lunchbox and wonders if anyone sees them, someone who believes or wants to believe that character matters more than cash. Share it with them, because it does matter. It always has. And check out the next video on your screen right now. I have another story from my courtroom that I think will stay with you. Another moment where ordinary people showed me something extraordinary about the human spirit. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. Because after 40 years, I'm still learning. And I hope you are too. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law. Every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.